Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jenn Gile. I'm with NGINX. I'm a product marketer focusing on Kubernetes and microservices. And here with me this morning is Brian. Brian, say, hey, who are you, all that?
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Brian Ehlert. I'm the product manager for NGINX Ingress Controller, which is what we're kind of going to focus on today is a few things Kubernetes, especially things that you need to plan for as a consumer of the Kubernetes platform.
Yeah, so we hear from a lot of customers throughout their adoption of Kubernetes, and especially if they're already deep into production, that there are a lot of problems when it comes to version management. And so that's what we're here to talk about, is what those problems are, the complexity that surrounds them, and some things that you can do to avoid or recover from those problems. And so one thing I do want to make clear first off is that we don't work for Kubernetes, or we're not speaking for Kubernetes rather, but we're speaking from our experience as people in the Kubernetes space. We're streaming today on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So give us a shout out on any of those platforms. If you have questions, we'll be answering them throughout the hour. So yeah, with that said, hi to everyone who's commented so far. We'll go ahead and jump right in. Let's see. Can I make the slides show up? There we go. So this is kind of a high-level overview of what we're going to be talking about. It looks complicated because it is. We're going to be breaking it into 3 somewhat digestible chunks. The first chunk is that top line. We'll be talking about Kubernetes platform versioning itself. The next section, we'll get into the Ingress API for Kubernetes. And then finally, we'll talk about what it's like to do version management for the tools you're using on Kubernetes, and specifically in our case, NGINX Ingress Controller. But this is a lot to look at and think about from the top. So we're going to dial it back a little bit and just look at this top line. So Brian, let's just start really high level. How do you define version management theory, and what does Kubernetes do for their versioning program?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit. So for those people in the software world, this is going to be real common, right? Because Kubernetes follow a semantic versioning pattern, and that's generally when we talk about that, from a major minor patch perspective. So a major release. So in this case, Kubernetes is 1. Right? They have no plans for a 2. They freely state that on their website at this point in time. But then we get into the minor releases, and minor releases, you can think of feature releases, and Kubernetes releases those on a regular cadence, and features basically come into those releases, and whether, based on fitness and whatnot, is whether they'll make it out into the world. And then we've got the patch releases. So after we get into a minor release, then we patch that to maintain it. So those could be security updates, those could be bug fixes, those could be a few other things during that maintenance window that Kubernetes has for a release.
All right, we can see a little bit of the cadence here. It's roughly every 3 to 4 months. What is Kubernetes stated versioning cadence, Brian?
Yeah, and this is where it starts to. This is kind of the first level where we start to get mildly confusing, right? So they state they're going to release four versions a year, so 4 minor releases a year, but each minor release, and it's basically a sliding scale if you want to think of it that way. And then each minor release is in maintenance for a year. So say 1.23 dropped back in December. So that will be in maintenance for a full year. So until this year's December, that will be maintained. And by maintained, that branch is actively worked on and actively updated. So you'll see bug fixes go in. You'll see more than just security updates. And then you get back to, you go backwards in time, and once that year hits, then they go into maintenance mode. And basically what that is they make sure I get the terminology correct. And what that is they have just where they hit life support, if you want to think of it from a perspective of that. So, critical patches, security fixes, primarily is what you're going to see at that point in time. So I call that kind of life support mode. So it's no longer being actively maintained. It's in life support. And then it hits full end of life after that, which means Kubernetes is not doing anything with it anymore. And you're kind of on your own, and you're kind of at risk as far as you run this release version.
So I think it's pretty likely that most of the community and our customers are not on version 1.23 yet when it released in December, or in the last, 3 to 4 weeks. So why don't we talk through why organizations don't just flip the switch and upgrade immediately?
Well, they definitely don't upgrade in production, right? So there are organizations that run their own Kubernetes clusters, and they install the base Kubernetes flavor. I'll kind of refer to it as a flavor, where they're running native Kubernetes. They're not using a managed service. They're not using a third party deployment or management engine, OpenShift, Rancher, et cetera, et cetera. And then they might install the latest Kubernetes, but they'll run it from a testing perspective. They might look at it from a test perspective. They're all in on Kubernetes. It is their base platform that they do all their deployments, all their running on, and they're going to do that. And then you move into the cloud services. The cloud services always kind of trail behind a little bit, because they take some time to make sure it's stable on their platform, right? Because now they're offering a stable platform, and that's kind of the value add, is they have all the infrastructure around that and the stability around that, so that gives them a chance to stabilize. That's what enterprises kind of do too, and this is the reason why a lot of people aren't on the bleeding edge. They generally lag, but now we get all the way down to the end customer. So especially enterprises that run their own clusters, for safety reasons, they might sit on a version because it is a platform, right? It's this major thing that's under the hood that all my services sit and run on top of. They may sit on versions for a long time after that. A year for some enterprises to consume a change might actually be, kind of aggressive because of their staffing level or a few other things. And as we look at that, and just talk about the platform by itself, is you get into you kind of get into this risk management situation. But usually nobody's on that bleeding edge from a production standpoint. There are a few exceptions, so I will mention that.
So a lot of planning is taking place. There's dozens of stakeholders that are impacted depending on the changes that have happened to Kubernetes. But there's another side of it, right? There are organizations that don't upgrade because it's scary. So maybe you can talk about some horror stories of what happens when you upgrade without a plan, or maybe if you wait too long to upgrade.
Yeah, we do have some real situations that happened this past year where folks kind of got caught. Not everybody hears about these kind of things, right? Because most people kind of keep this stuff close to vest, and they don't talk about it. But there was a situation, say this past year, where folks were sitting on old versions of GKE. Okay. I will admit that they rather really old versions, actually. I mean, it was kind of surprising, and they had the platform upgraded underneath them, and as a result of that, they ran into some break situations. Yes, they were brought to a safe platform, but now you get into the next level of all of a sudden some of their objects, the individual configuration objects, were suddenly broken because of other changes. And this gets into the complexity that we're going to get into. So while you might think you're being stable and you're sitting on an old version, you're taking all that risk of managing, of security vulnerabilities, of you're not going along with the innovation. So as you start to read and rely on search for how to do things, your platform's not coming along with that. And in theory, in theory, it's a platform, right? It should be safe to upgrade it, and your consumers shouldn't know any better, right? And then, but that's kind of where we get into the multiple layers of what what can be going on here in the multiple layers of interaction, because Kubernetes is more than just the major release versions when we actually get down to it and we actually start to talk about all the impacts that we can run into.
So let's say someone's using a platform like OpenShift or Rancher, or a managed service like you mentioned GKE or EKS. How do you recommend that they manage keeping an eye on Kubernetes versioning?
Yeah, it matters to them as well, right? Because OpenShift is built on, there's still a version of Kubernetes under the hood. Rancher, there's still a version of Kubernetes on the hood. Yes, there's some additional value added to that, right? And there's some additional framework that's built around that. But under its core, it's still the Kubernetes project, as well as the managed cloud services. The managed cloud services are a little easier to follow. Because they generally publish their information out there. It's pretty easy to find what version AKS, EKS, or GKE is on, for example. I recently went looking through some of the enterprise repackaging, and that was a little harder to figure out what version of Kubernetes you have under the hood from the documentation, right? And I'm going to say that from the documentation. After you have it, yeah, it's really easy just to query and figure out what that is. But when you're looking at the documentation, you're trying to plan ahead. You're trying to think ahead because you want to connect all these dots and you want to make all these associations. It's not necessarily as easy for customers to plan ahead, because now, mind you, this goes back to the theory of I should just be able to upgrade this platform, and my customers, my users, and I hate using that word, my users, my internal customers that are deploying things on top of this platform that I'm providing this utility, right, within the enterprise. I should just be able to do that, and there should be a safety margin to that.
So let's move now to the second row. And this is one that in particular, I won't say it became a problem necessarily for people late last year, but it definitely spawned a lot of blogs and commentary on social media, is the change for the Ingress API moving from the betas to V1. And so, with each release of Kubernetes, this can happen. New APIs are introduced, old ones are deprecated or removed. First, Brian, how do you define the difference between deprecation and removal, and why do you think that matters?
Yeah, and just to, I mean, this is kind of the complexity of the layer, which is the whole reason why we're doing this, right? Like you mentioned, there's a this really came out. We focus on the networking space within Kubernetes, right? This happens across the entire platform, and the whole Kubernetes platform is divided into special interest groups. So everybody has an area. Ingress falls under networking, but really what's going on here is that the objects are versioning separate from the platform. So it's not one big API version that happens here. So if you think of some products where you might have, product server URL / versions / the interface I want to interact with, and it's the same, for this whole release. Down here at the Kubernetes layer, when we start to interact with individual objects, and in that YAML file that you define, there's an interface and a version of that interface, but that actually relates to that object that you're defining. So as Kubernetes moves through alpha, objects move from alpha, relative instability. We can change whatever we want, blah, blah, blah. There's not a lot of guarantee, to beta, where guarantees start to be introduced into that interface of, we're not going to break anything. We're going to allow you to move from version to version to version, to what Ingress finally did, which is move to full V1, which is basically stable. We're not going to actively change anymore unless there's like some big huge problem. We're now going to park here at this stable version, and that's really what started a lot of this conversation. And I know I totally flew by your question, Jen. So pull me back a little bit, because this is all live. Okay, deprecation versus removal. Thank you. I'm going to bring this up because I actually I talk with, software, engineers about this as well. From a customer perspective, deprecation is an announcement that uh, a software company makes to their users to say, guess what? At some future point in time, we're not going to maintain this anymore. So that's a statement of deprecation of we're just not going to maintain this interface. What it means for the Kubernetes community is slightly different. It's a combination of this statement that there's going to be a deprecation, but it's also an announcement that we're going to make a change. So and they talk about deprecation from literally from a version perspective, not from I mean, yeah, there might be a full API deprecation, but that's unlikely for compatibility reasons. So V1 of the Ingress resource went through this life cycle, if you can see there, of there was an announcement of a deprecation that aligned with a version release, and then there was a literal removal. So it's not that we're going to deprecate it and this API is going to last forever, like you might see with some commercial products you interact with, but literally deprecation is a step towards removal. It's the announcement, it's the alert that, this version of this API is literally going away. So you might have seen, after this was implemented, you'd issue a kube controller, a kubectl command against an ingress resource. There'd be a little warning on your screen that would actually go up and, this is being deprecated. Well, right there is an indication to you as a consumer of these resources that, oh, you need to go figure out what it is, because with this particular product, that means at some point in time, that actually version is going to go away on you. And
So let's take a time machine and go back to what, October 2020-ish?
Yep.
And say that's probably when that notification first started popping up. Ideally, I would have at that time started investigating Ingress V1 and hopefully start moving things over to be using that API as opposed to the beta, right?
Right, and you get into a few things here, right? Because it's when the deprecation notice starts to appear, you get into this crossover period. So if you just look at the slide right there, and I have this overwhelming urge to draw on the screen, but I can't. So if you look at this slide right there, V1 appeared in October 2020, but you see these two lines overlap for a period of time, all the way until 1.1.22. And what was going on here was there was a version of overlapping compatibility where the API object of V1 Beta 1 worked and the API object of V1 also worked. So in that namespace reference in your YAML file, you have this period of time as an operator or as an administrator of Kubernetes as a platform to start to go through your objects and figure out what your game plan is. So one, you need to get up to what these overlap versions, version of Kubernetes really is that gives you this overlapping compatibility. And then two, this is your window of time when you can move from one version to another. Because at some point in time, you're going to want to move to a newer version of Kubernetes. You're going to want to make sure that all your referenced objects are actually up at this new version, so you can continue to move forward with the platform as the platform progresses as a whole.
And I mean, that's what really ended up happening around October, is there were certainly people who didn't realize it was going to be removed and weren't ready. We did see some people upgrade to 1.22 without being prepared to use the new Ingress API. And so let's talk about what it looks like to prepare to use a new API. What does that process look like?
Yeah, so just to it's a little bit what I was describing there, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do have some people that are holding on the older version of Kubernetes, right? Which essentially they might be using an older version of an API. They might have a business reason that they're stuck on an old version of an API. They might have some dependent thing that's stuck on an old version of Kubernetes due to an old version of API. So it's all these dependencies that you work out. So they can even move to the the compatible phase.
Mm-hmm.
Then when we get to this period of compatibility, I mean, you generally know. So before 1.19 came out, there was an announcement of deprecation that appeared. You might not notice it because it's not in the box at that point in time. It became in the box at 1.19. If you follow the networking special interest group, you would catch the fact that is. And I think this gets into a little bit of where do you catch these things? It's not always evident where you might catch these changes, to anticipate them ahead of time. So this, it moves it in, and it tries to get the notification inbox to make it really easy for people to go through to catch what these changes are. In the case of Ingress, okay. In the case of Ingress, you're moving along, you're running your Ingress controller. You might be stuck on an old version of either our Ingress controller or another Ingress controller. So get those up to new releases that are currently compatible with the current API. Take advantage of these crossover periods. And mind you, I'm talking about core Kubernetes delivered API objects. So in this case, I'm talking about Ingress resources. So if you've got a vendor, I mean, we also produce custom resource definitions, right? Those are objects that we own. Those are outside of Kubernetes, and we actually maintain the versions of those, and it's totally different. So you still get into a situation, but there's some compatibility and some guarantees. There's conformance tests that we actually do as we follow through to make sure that we're conformant with Kubernetes as Kubernetes moves through. We're conformant with the API and the API standard as that changes as far as our implementation goes. So as Kubernetes progresses, products that run on Kubernetes have to progress as well. So this is where you get into where you start to get into now these two layers, and they have to move together as you progress forward through time. But specifically, so the Ingress object updated. There was also a change to Ingress class that needed to be consumed at that point in time as well. So Ingress class moved over to Ingress class name, which was another change that needed to be taken in as a result of that, or that came in around the same time. So there's other changes that happen to these objects that might need to be considered as well. As a vendor, we try to make sure that our customers are aware of these changes. So as changes happen, they can go through and update them as well.
Yeah, so that's a good time to jump into Ingress controller row on this. And so we're using us as an example of what the versioning looks like. So first off, we did move to 2.0 with the release of Kubernetes 1.22, and that was not necessarily to signal a big change in the product, but rather the compatibility with Ingress v1. It did require some big changes for us. And so you'll see, I wish I could draw on this thing, huh? Be super helpful. Under October 2021, that 1.22 and that 2.0 kind of line up there. And so let's talk through first, Brian, what was involved? What did our engineering team have to do to validate NGINX Ingress Controller 2.0 for that new version of both Kubernetes and the Ingress API?
Yeah, so we're constantly validating against. So we decide to cut a release. We validate against the maintained versions of Kubernetes at that point in time, right? So if a version of Kubernetes is already end of life, out of maintenance, we don't validate against that. So we're always moving forward as Kubernetes moves forward. So that's one thing. We always guarantee that we have compatibility with the currently maintained versions of Kubernetes at this point in time. We're not the only vendor that follows that type of pattern. In regards to V1, okay, now we have to start validating against this new API object. And in your YAML file, you reference one API object or the other API object. But because of the removal, we went along and we decided to pull and focus on what the new interface was. The version change that we did is no different than the version change that the community Ingress controller did. And it was essentially to signal to customers following, semantic versioning patterns of there's a breaking change here. Mind you, it wasn't a breaking change in our product so much as there's a breaking change here that you need to consider. So if you want to sit on an older version, then there's some considerations that you need to take there. If you want to move forward, we're basically forcing you to have some awareness that there's this V1 change that needed to go in there. There might be some other object modifications that you need to consume along the way, but we're gonna pull those in there as well. We release on a quarterly pattern, essentially 4 times a year, just like Kubernetes does. So we're constantly testing, we're constantly validating, we're constantly moving forward as a product as the platform progresses forward as well.
Okay, so let's say I use NGINX. I'm using an older version 1.12. I want to make the move to 2.0. I have, because I'm upgrading Kubernetes, I'm going to go with 1.22 or 1.23. What kind of configs do I need to look at to make sure I don't mess up the whole thing?
Yeah, and this is welcome to release notes and judiciously reviewing release notes, right? Anytime you make a leap and you're leaping through versions, so you're making a version leap. So in this case, you're making a version leap with us, which, because we're moving along with the Kubernetes project, you're making a version leap with the Kubernetes project as well. So, and this is where you get into evaluating these API objects. I mentioned ingress class and ingress class name. There's also version leaps. In one case, we ran into a situation with customers using a version of Ingress Controller that's actually off this slide to the left, right? So they had some other object changes that they needed to consider as we get in this. And when you look to products and how we generally talk about this, because releases are a moment in time, we'll talk about a particular release with those release notes. So there's not a really elegant way to say, oh, I'm updating from this version, which is, might be over a year old, and I'm making a leap up to here. What are all the deltas in between? And there's not a great way to do that. Short releases, it's really quick. It's generally really easy, and it's pretty painless. When we get into longer ones, there was an old version of Kubernetes that they changed secrets and how secrets were formatted and held. That was a gotcha that some of our customers got into just within the past year. And that was just customers pulling up to newer versions of Kubernetes. I mean, they were just trying to get close to 1.18 to help them prepare for before 1.19 came into play. So, and that's not even getting into the point where they needed to start to worry about this situation.
The ingress, yeah. So we are going to go ahead and drop our 2.0 release notes in the chat so that people can see what that looked like, kind of what that communication style is. I want to move to a topic that we've been hearing a lot about, really since the summer or the fall, is the Gateway API. And there seems to be a lot of both conversation and confusion over why is there a new API? How are they different? So let's just start with what is it?
Okay. So first of all, I want to disambiguate. This is Gateway API. This is a Kubernetes project about a new API object. This is not to be confused with an API gateway,
yeah.
which is a set of use cases that people implement, which might be implemented on some sort of reverse proxy or load balancer or something like that. So this is the Gateway API project. So as Kubernetes, Ingress has actually been around for a long time. Just our Ingress product has been around for, I think, around 6 years now.
I think we're at 7 now.
We're at 7 now. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Ingress has some limitations, and those limitations have been seen, but yet the API itself, most vendors, kind of forked off into bespoke ways of doing things and CRDs and whatnot. So we lost some of the commonality. Gateway API, in theory, is an effort to bring that back, to create more standard to the core API objects across all the implementations. So whether that be with ours, whether that be with community, whether that be with some of our competitors, at least the core objects are a bit more encompassing of the functionality that you have, and we all start from a more common place. There's more commonality. So the differentiators under the hood end up being, a bit different. And it's makes it easier on you folks as users of these things to do it. Gateway API is still in the alpha stages. The working group, we meet on a regular basis. There's constantly change going into the API specification, so we're still sitting in the alpha stages. There are some reference implementations out there. You'll see from us joining the fray shortly as well. But it is a different core object. So you've got this ingress object, which kind of sets the root of the definition for your ingress. You've got this gateway object, which does the same thing. And gateway also is trying to encompass some aspects of things like, service mesh extensions. And it's trying to encompass some other things beyond, this simple, I want to bring traffic into my cluster, and this is my load balancer at the edge sort of thing.
So you're expecting that it will be a bit richer in the future than what you can do with the Ingress API.
Yeah, it should be richer. It will allow more. It's more encompassing of the spirit of, I have this entry point. It might be traffic coming in, which is ingress. It might be traffic going out, which is egress. It might be a little bit of the routing and something. So as we get into service mesh capabilities that are like, oh, I actually want to extend from this cluster to some other cluster, or I actually want to extend,
whatever it may be. Yeah.
Yep. So as we get into those things, yeah.
How far away do you think it is from V1? Based on what you've seen with the technology, the conversations you're hearing in the networking SIG.
I know that the SIG has some targets, and I know that the SIG is trying to get the API to beta, so we can get to a level of stability that between all the implementations, folks can actually start to kick the tires on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's beta. I mean, yes, it might not do all the things that Ingress can do at that point in time, because frankly, Ingress has been around so long, we can do a lot of things with Ingress. Gateway might not be all encompassing of those things at the time when the API specification goes to beta, but the intention is definitely to get the high level constructs in there. Start with a base set of functionality to get it out there. Hopefully within some time in the next few months. And I don't want to speak for the timelines of the primary folks working on the project, but I know the intention is that us as a group, there is a drive to see if that API spec can move to beta sometime in the near time frame. I'll say that vaguely as a PM. It's kind of something that's beat into us.
So what you're expecting to see then is probably, once it reaches beta, people using these two APIs side by side in the same cluster.
You could. Yeah, there's no reason why you wouldn't do that. But
Mm-hmm.
like at the same time, you've got two root implementations. So most likely you're gonna fiddle with it with some application or set of services or whatnot. You might start to fiddle with
Mm-hmm.
Gateway API to get a feel for it. It's different. It's different from Ingress. There's a move away from annotations. it has a feel to it that's a lot closer to, say, the custom resource definitions that we have for the Ingress controller that we maintain as NGINX, and less annotations. It's built around, some of the concepts of role delegation, at the resource level, which is a little bit, the path that we started down a few years back as well. So it's a different feel. It'll be a different workflow for folks when they start to move over to it.
Is there a stated intent for Gateway to replace Ingress?
At some point in time, Ingress will kind of, Ingress has kind of moved there, right? Already is Ingress as an object set isn't really being maintained anymore, and richer functionality and more advanced functionality as we progress through networking, Gateway will be extended to encompass that. Will Ingress go away anytime soon? I don't see Ingress feasibly disappearing for years, quite honestly, just because of customers consuming changes. I mean, when we look at some of our customers that have thousands of services behind their Kubernetes installation, I mean,
That's not a small lift to switch
right
over.
right and as you delegate things, I mean, there's also customers that build platform as a service, right? That they might be offering services, and they have, like coded integrations and whatnot that automatically create resources and a few other things. So as applications are being offered, and that's manipulating the Ingress object as part of their offering, that's potentially a lot to take in, but I say thousands. I've heard numbers, 15,000, 20,000 individual services across, multiple Kubernetes clusters and multiple data centers and all this. So people do run it at pretty good scale, and then you start to get into the coordination of, oh, it's not just the platform team that owns the Ingress objects, but we actually delegate certain things to other teams within our organization to manipulate these objects. Now we've got to coordinate this across this huge number of stakeholders. I hate that word. Across this huge number of people within the organization that have to start to consume these changes. That alone can set in motion, a year-long conversion project, right? As we start to talk about safety and whatnot.
So that's timely for our, how do we make all of this actionable? What can you do? These are our 4 steps. It's, again, this is the NGINX perspective. What we're looking at is you're going to have to upgrade at some point. So first of all, research the versioning. We've covered a lot of points on that one, knowing whether you're using vanilla Kubernetes or, a platform or a managed service, what version are you using? And, when is it going to be no longer actively maintained? So knowing where you are as well as where you're going, what the requirements are for moving to that new version. Brian, you were just talking about identifying stakeholders, the humans involved. How many humans are we likely talking about here?
It literally depends on the company. For some companies, it could be 5. For some companies, it could be hundreds, depending. I mean, when in the large example, when you get into thousands of services, I mean, you could have an engineer per every microservice. You could have a team of engineers per multiple microservices, but you're potentially talking hundreds of people that you need to coordinate against, and that's for the API objects themselves, the things that are delegated, which is separate from the platform that you might be moving forward. So that's where we get into these kind of different levels of the versioning that you really need to be aware of as platform maintainers of, as a platform operations team that's delivering this platform as a service capability.
Yeah. So before we even get into steps 3 and 4, let's talk about that team that's responsible for this work or the person. There's been talk about platform ops teams, teams made up of architects and SREs and, focused on the operations of the Kubernetes platform, being a growing discipline. Do you have some observations about what kind of people, what kind of skills are needed to be able to pull this off, especially at a larger scale?
I mean, when you get into, I'm going to talk about the larger scale ones, right? Because that's where we start to get more complex. Smaller scale, it might be a handful of people. I do all the things for Kubernetes, like we used to talk about virtualization admins, a decade ago. But it's really, I think a lot of enterprises are really realizing that there's a team, because Kubernetes, we've got a networking stack under the hood. We've got a CNI layer under the hood that a networking team might also influence from a capability and whatnot perspective. We've got storage people, right? We've got compute people. There's hypervisors under there in most cases, and there's some additional abstractions under there. So our virtualization admins come in, our networks operations folks come in. We have SREs that run services that run on top of the platform. So they've got capabilities that they might do. We might have SREs that are responsible for the care and maintenance of Kubernetes itself. Just giving Kubernetes love, that are going to be dealing with other problems as they start to talk about these things. Because it's definitely multi-layer, right? Because Kubernetes is an orchestration platform. That pulls a lot of functionality together. It creates this wonderful GitOps flow that a lot of people are gravitating to. It creates the infrastructure as code model that a lot of people are gravitating to. So all these kind of esoteric things that are around the front end, there's still a lot of skill set to make these things operate and function and work on a day-to-day basis. As an old systems IT person, we used to touch these things directly, but as cloud services and platform platform things have come into play, we talk less about these things, but those skills are still out there. There's still people out there that do these low level things under the hood. So it's not just about the consumption side of Kubernetes, which we do talk about a lot, but it's actually all these other roles and relationships that work together under the hood. So
yeah, a lot of hidden people down there. So after 1 and 2, 3 maybe starts to sound like the easier step. After you figured out who all your people are and where all the stuff is.
Honestly, identifying the things is the hardest part of this whole thing. Once you identify all the, take some time. Identify all the moving parts. Figure out a way to analyze all your resource objects through your source control. Figure out a way to research the version of Kubernetes you're on. Figure out a way to keep up with the primary resource objects and the APIs that you use as a company. Okay, not everybody uses Ingress, right? Because there's different ways to define service. So if you use Ingress, if networking is important to you and you want to move forward, you have to invest some time in paying attention to the networking SIG. Kubernetes has a really good blog as well, so they generally try to alert you to the things you need to pay attention to, but you actually have to pull on those things. They don't push at you necessarily.
Yeah, we'll drop that link in the chat. Finally, when you and I were talking about this session initially, we were talking about failing forward, and you made a comment about how the way that Kubernetes does version management can be challenging for organizations that don't have either a foundation in delivering software, are already familiar with the software cycle, or organizations that are not born in the cloud. And so let's talk just briefly about what those challenges are and why the fail forward, because you can roll back your services, but you don't want to roll back your platform.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Nobody likes to fail back anymore. I mean, if it's something that really came around when the cloud vendors, I saw it a little bit in the IT space. I mean, there was back in the day, we would roll back, right? Because we would go through and we would make some sort of infrastructure change. It would be bad. We had redundant equipment, we had other things, and we would go backwards. And when the advent of kind of cloud and abstracted infrastructure started to come in, a lot of practices changed where people started to roll forward. Database change, all this thing. Nobody wanted to go backwards anymore because there's always this fear that's coupled with going backwards of what am I going to lose? So everybody always wants to have a fail forward mentality. So the things that some people have intercepted that have already dealt with this, there's like, oh, all of a sudden my ingress resources are all broken. Quick, jump in, modify the objects that I need to modify. Hopefully it's manageable in some time frame, right? Yes, there was an outage. We'll take that outage, but everything's up and running, everything's fixed. We're gonna continue on forward. As operations folks, we like to plan for those things, right?
It's going to be a lot more damage to try to roll
we
back
like
than
to
just fix it.
exactly. We like to have some concept of what we're getting into before it hits, because we're so used to being in that firefighting mode. There is a huge desire in operations to be proactive, right? To plan ahead as much as possible, so those fires end up being minimal. So those fires literally end up being only the things that we could not plan for. So it's always it's not that I'm saying, fail forward. I'm saying that there's already this trend out there that's what everybody wants to do. That's what developers want to do. That's what a lot of admins want to do. It's just a practice that's come out. And if you have that mentality, make sure that you're doing your planning up front so that you can continue to do that and support your your operations in that way.
All right, we're coming up on the top of the hour. We've got about 12 minutes left until you and I have to jump into our days. I'll reopen the invitation. If you have questions for us, please drop them in the comments. We can talk about Kubernetes. We can talk about Ingress. We can talk about cats. That's an option.
I was about to say my cats are in the other room. See, I did that so we don't have to deal with them.
Go ahead and drop another resource in the comments. We published a blog about a week ago on Kubernetes Networking 101. We do get a lot of questions about why an Ingress controller is needed at all. And I'll say you don't necessarily need one. It depends on what you're trying to achieve and the complexity of your deployments. Node port and load balancer are certain ways that you can get traffic in, but there are drawbacks. And so if you're unfamiliar with that, there's a resource there. I don't see any questions coming in. We'll give it another, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this has been useful. I mean, we're trying to make this quite kind of complete, right? And I hope this has been useful to at least get people to understand the places they need to look. There are horror stories out there. Yes, in the end, they all got resolved, right? And people look at them in various ways. We do have customers that stick on old versions of Kubernetes, and the folks that are constantly moving to newer versions of Kubernetes, I think are more or less in the cycle. But even then, as you think about those sliding scales that we had on an earlier slide, there's this period of API version, object version compatibility that Kubernetes gives you, and it's this great window that allows you to convert from one version to the next. But at the same time, there's people that get caught in that because they're like, oh, well, my v1 beta 1 objects are still missing or still working, blah blah blah. And then all of a sudden they make some other version leap with Kubernetes, and it's like everything's broken because they didn't realize that there was this compatibility. It was in there. Say they might upgrade our Ingress, they might upgrade Kubernetes, but they're still within that compatibility window from an API perspective. And then they make that next step where they move past the version removal of an object. Because, and I'm going to say this way, so during that compatibility window, if you have a v1 beta 1 object, Kubernetes will present that as both a v1 and a v1 beta 1 to consumers that are on that platform. So we as a product, you might install the 2.0 version of our product that only sees the v1 version of the object, and your objects are v1 beta 1. We can, because of this compatibility and the way this compatibility works, we see that. And we actually see a v1 object represented, even though your YAML might say v1 beta 1 for your objects. And then when you make that next leap is actually where you get caught. So if you're not thinking ahead and you're not planning ahead, so that's like one of those huge gotchas for people to be aware of. So as you know, a deprecation's in there. Deprecation means there's going to be a removal at some point in time. So when you see deprecation notices, pay attention to them, especially when it comes around Kubernetes API objects, to make sure that you don't get caught at some point in the future because you're not paying attention, or you don't get caught at some point in the future because, oh, your platform provider, because somebody else is providing the platform to you, they're like, nah, you've sat on that old version for way too long. We're not going to support that anymore. We're going to force upgrade you to a version that we think is safe, but something might break because guess what? Your version is, well over a year old, because Kubernetes maintains for a year. They release a version, they actively maintain that for a year. After that, it kind of goes on life support. It's not maintained. It gets critical patches, which goes for another period. But it's essentially off maintenance, and it's set up for end of life at that point in time. It's just a really rigorous, regular schedule, and it's just folks being aware of that and kind of getting into that mindset, especially for folks that are new to Kubernetes, right? Because there's still people coming onto Kubernetes it's still new to them. So,
right. So the big takeaway is don't get caught. And the TLDR here is go read the blog. We've got a nice, short, snappy blog that gives an overview of the 3 steps that we talked about. Not in as much depth, but you can always come back here. And then a bit of a history of NGINX Ingress Controller in case you're curious what's next. So with that said, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. And Brian, see you when I see you.
Yep. See you later.